Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for being part of the National Day of Dialogue. It is a tremendous honor for me to be here with some of the best bridgers in America, not only in this session, but in the other sessions taking place throughout the day. Thank you so much to Christy and IDEOS Institute for hosting this National Day of Dialogue to advance our collective mission. I'm going to do a few introductions before we get into the conversation. I'm Pierce Godwin, founder and CEO of Listen First Project and the Listen First Coalition of 500 organizations who are bringing Americans together across divides to listen and understand each other, to find common ground, and to make bridge building and collaboration norms. Listen First Project is honored to serve as the backbone organization for the Bridging Movement Alignment Council, BMAC, which is the collective impact initiative advancing our mission. Tommy Akavan is the executive director of the Center for the Political Future at the University of Southern California. He joined USC after serving as the CEO of Procon.org, the nation's leading source of nonpartisan research on controversial issues. Thanks for being here, buddy.
My pleasure.
Becca Curl is the executive director of Living Room Conversations. She specializes in large-scale community dialogue on pressing issues and has designed and led healthy dialogue practices in high schools, universities, civic organizations, faith communities, as well as in her own family and community. It always hits close to home, doesn't it? Finally, Manu Meal is passionate about empowering young people to bridge divides. As CEO of Bridge USA, he is building the largest and fastest growing student movement to bridge our differences and change how we talk politics. Manu was honored last year as one of the Forbes 30 Under 30. Today, we're going to have a free-flowing conversation and welcome everybody who's dialed in to join us in talking to leaders who spend day and night thinking about the successes and setbacks in the age of polarization. Let's get it going. So we're seeing more and more Americans reach that moment, right, when the personal pain and the national fear that's wrought by this toxic polarization becomes stronger than our own tribal instincts. This is the moment when we start looking for a way out of toxic polarization. Tell us about that moment for each of you personally. Manu.
Well, thanks, Pierce. Thanks, Becca, Kami, Christy, IDEOS, and all the folks that are watching. I can say that we're currently in California, and this is the 1 week in California's history where it decided to rain. So I'm grateful to be here. Well, you know, I never had any interest in politics. Like, in fact, my interest in politics has decreased over the last 2 years. It started for me as a freshman at UC Berkeley in 2017 when we had this controversial speaker by the name of Milo Yiannopoulos come to campus. And Milo, for those of you that might not know, was this right-wing speaker, and he really riled up folks. And I remember distinctly, I was walking back from my math seminar and this like cafe window was shattered. And inside this cafe window, there's a CNN banner that said, UC Berkeley students are protesting free speech. And fascinatingly enough, the television crew filming that was standing right next to me. And that was like the breaking of the fourth wall. And importantly, there was just so much anger and resentment and fear. And I'm someone that, you know, it comes from India and my family's grown up there. And I just am so deeply and viscerally impacted by the fact that we live in a moment where students would be willing to skip 6 hours of class to go out there and demonstrate and argue and criticize and be violent about their convictions. And to me, that's a problem. And I want to do everything I can with amazing leaders like yourselves to try and stitch those bonds. So excited for the conversation.
Thanks, Manu. Becca, tell us about the moment for you that led to you being here today.
I moved to Utah about 8 years ago and got in touch with people that I knew. I had a former college roommate whose husband was involved in bridging work, and he was putting on an event in Salt Lake City. So I attended the event, and there was these two groups of therapists that were on the point of pursuing litigation against each other. So they were both saying, within our professional code of ethics, there's no way you can be treating your LGBTQ plus clients the way that you are. So there were some that were doing reparative therapy, some that were doing affirmative therapy. They're like, this is completely unethical. We're going to take you to court. And they had convened over a series of conversations. And so this event was kind of the culmination where they were talking about the experience. And they didn't change any minds, but they got to the point where they understood where each other were coming from and said, you know what? I would still never do that. But if I had a client who wanted that, I would refer them to you. And it just kind of it was this really mind expanding, like, yes, these are the conversations that we need to be having all the time, everywhere, where we don't have to vilify each other, but we can understand where we're coming from, which really kind of contextualizes and centers the human experience and the issues, these critical social issues that we're facing and grappling with in our communities and in our families. And it just really kind of lit a fire that I was like, I want to be having conversations like this and bringing them to my community. And I ended up going to the mayor's office and just said, you know what? I think we should be having these kinds of conversations here. There are conversations we need to be having, and we need to be intentional about it. And so I started organizing large scale community dialogue just on my own. I had some support of some local people and just tried to figure it out and bring it to my community, which then kind of led to where I am now.
Thanks, Becca. Tommy, what was the pivotal moment for you that set you on this mission?
Well, I got to say there's underlying factors, and I think they're probably ones that we all share. So one of the underlying factors for me is being named Kami and growing up in southern rural Louisiana. Not a lot of Kamis in the Opelousas region. And so naturally you become a bridge builder, and all of us to some degree are outsiders of the communities that we're in. So we just naturally have an inclination to want to get along, go along to get along. So there's that. Then high school was all about speech and debate. And in debate, as you know, you could be on one side one day, the other side the other day. You have to learn how to see issues from different perspectives. I think it's a wonderful way to train people on bridging. But those were the underlying conditions. What really set me off was starting Pro-Con. When I started there, I saw the impact that it had on people who perhaps for the first time ever heard an honest, powerful, compelling argument and reasons for why they should think this particular way on a gun issue or on abortion or on the death penalty or on felon vote. And those aha moments that I could see other people having, that was energizing, because it wasn't just for 10 or 20 people, it was for hundreds of millions of people. And I thought, we can do this. And that's what gets me fired up.
Oh, that's beautiful. My moment was a rather extreme example of what we're encouraging all Americans of all backgrounds and beliefs to do, right? I got way outside of my bubble. Southern white Christian dude going over to Uganda for 6 months in 2013. And that perspective, looking back on America, realizing I was going to come home to the most materially prosperous nation on earth, but see this abject relational poverty taking hold. The exact opposite of what I had seen and been so deeply inspired by in Uganda is what made me say, what the heck is going on here? We got to find a different path forward. I want you all to paint a picture of the work you're doing. And as we talk about, the setbacks and the successes in the age of polarization, particularly focus not only on painting that picture, but on some of the best practices that you employ in the work you do. Kami, we'll start with you.
Well, the future often feels bleak. And so we want to be able to shape and guide it. And sometimes it feels very daunting. And the way I feel about it is the way I think a lot of us feel about like global climate change. Like, I'm one person. What can I possibly do? Like, well, I'll recycle, or I'll take the bus, or I'll ride the bike, or I'll walk today, or we do what we can. And so those do what we can moments, I think, are important for me to take and for all of us to take, where you don't have to save the world. You just have to do your part, do a little bit. So the thing for me that I think works really well is just taking any kind of action, because then you get yourself in a positive lane and you're a contributor to the bridging work, whatever that is. And if you're inspired by it, you'll keep going and doing more and more and more of it. But on a broader scale, honestly, Pearson, you know this well, listen first. I can't tell you how many times when people were exposed to opposing arguments for the first time, they saw issues in a light they had never considered. And it wasn't because they're stubborn or resistant. It's just because they had never seen it. They so in their own lane and their own filter bubbles, own ideological chambers. They just didn't realize that, wow, that's a whole new way to think about it. And when you listen, you learn those kinds of things and see from another person's perspective and go, they're not crazy. They just got to their viewpoint in a very different way. And I didn't realize that these were the facts and circumstances and life experiences that led these people to think these ways. And that's really powerful. And the more of that we can do, and I'm not saying it's easy, but it's listening and it's basic, right? If we can do more of that, I really think start there. And I got 50 other things to do, but you got to start there as your number one.
Love that. The idea of looking in the mirror, starting with me, starting with those of us on this stage and everybody joining us. That's something we can all do immediately. Now, the students and stakeholders who are blessed to be a part of USC Center for the Political Future, tell us a little bit about that work and what you're doing in that capacity.
Well, we got to have faith in these young people, right, Manu? We gotta believe.
The young people.
That's right. We got to have faith in these young people because they want to change the world in these positive ways. They're not satisfied with the status quo, and they shouldn't be. So whenever we can empower these change agents in ways to give them practical experiences in politics, the right internships and scholarships, and experiences and networks, and I meet Senator so-and-so and Congressperson so-and-so and these political advocates and activists, and learn practically what do you got to do. So when young people are trained in those ways, then they become our hope for the future. They become not just, yes, I'm doing my part recycling, but they become the ones who are sort of the titans of those communities. And we need to see that because a lot of the change is within me, a lot of the change is between us, but we all know a lot of the change is systemic. And to get to those really difficult systemic changes, it's not just a single person. We got to have a whole network of people out there fighting those good fights.
Amen. 6 years ago, when I was thrilled to learn that it wasn't just little old me who wanted to do something about this problem, but there were other groups out there. Living Room Conversations was one of the 4 with whom we founded the Listen First Coalition. Talk about the work of LRC and the evidence-based best practices that you all employ.
Yeah, I think within, we all hold a different piece of the puzzle in the bridging movement. And there are so many different ways that you can do bridging work and help people to understand each other across differences. And what we do and kind of specialize in is making it really accessible. So we have a huge library of free resources. So anyone that wants to start today and try out some bridging work can just go and download a guide and say, all right, I'm going to find someone else. We're each going to invite 2 people. We're going to sit in a living room. We're going to have a conversation. And built into the guide, I think, are a lot of the underlying principles of bridging work. So our conversation agreements highlight things like curiosity, listening, showing respect and suspending judgment, kind of sharing airtime. So it's not just about you, but it's the group that you're in. And then all of our questions target personal experiences rather than opinions around a specific issue or topic. And I think that's something that's really relatable. I think bridging needs to be something that we can do every day. That every day we're doing bridging work. And so I think that this targeting personal experience rather than opinion is one of those ways that we can do it. So if someone posts something on social media that seems inflammatory or an article, I'll reach out and say, tell me what it was about this article that really resonated with you. Like, what was the one piece out of everything else? Or I'll follow up and ask a question. Questions are a great way to practice bridging anywhere and anytime, and just say, where have you seen that play out in your life? I'm curious. Like, here's your really strong opinion about this issue, but where has it showed up in your personal life? Because that's where you can develop curiosity and you can listen and ask questions. That's a lot more interesting than someone standing on their soapbox and having their sort of rehearsed, like, this is what I say when guns come up. Like, here's my thing. And just say, like, so one of the questions from a living room conversation would be like, what role have guns played in your life? Like, tell me that story. And then we can kind of go from there, because we're recentering the human experience. And that's where you start to make those, like you were talking about, those relational, or you were talking about like the relational poverty that we have. So that's kind of, I feel like.
Thank you so much. And thanks to LRC for leading the way for so many of us for so many years. Totally. Manu, young people have been invoked. Tell us about the pioneering work of Bridge USA, your best practices, your rapid expansion.
My long and extensive career of 2 years is quite illustrious. Now, I'm going to look at this from a slightly different angle, because I think Kami and Becca, you all have done a great job actually articulating what the work is. So in 2017, after that protest, right, we created the space for people to just decompress. So we had like some of the protest folks come out. We had some of the college students that were just disappointed by what was happening. We had the speakers and their invitees come out, and everybody was having this conversation. And afterwards, it was very well attended. Our work is oftentimes received in a way where, dialogue is important, it matters. But I distinctly remember this one kid come to me afterwards, and they said, what this work feels like sometimes is the house is on fire and we're bringing a squirt gun, right? and they're like, why should we care about dialogue when we think that if I'm a conservative, there's crises of faith and crises of free speech on campuses and in our societies, or if I'm a liberal and I feel that there's systemic injustices and there's police brutality and there's violence internationally happening, like, what is talking going to do about it? And the interesting thing is, young people oftentimes show up with a lot of moral ambition, so they're willing to ask a lot of the hard questions. And I think someone my age, and I don't know where sort of the audience is at, but I'm 24. I was born around 9/11. I went to middle school in the 2008 recession. I graduated high school in the year that was 2016, and then graduated college in 2020, which is the Capitol riots, the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests. Not a great sample size of boundless progress and democratic hope and optimism, right? And what that oftentimes leads, even those in the audience, you remember a world at the time where we were less divided. And it either leads to a lot of apathy, I'm going to give up, or it leads to hyper engagement. There's a fire, so I got to bring a fire hose. And then everybody shows up with a fire hose. Turns out there's no water, and what we have to start doing, and this is what bridge chapters are starting to do across the country. It's what I think a lot of us have started doing is we have to articulate bridge building, dialogue, conversation, civic engagement, not as the squirt gun to the fire that we have to put out, but as the theory of change, the thing that is going to get us out. The fact that if we can't talk to each other, then we lose the most basic component of a society. The fact is that humans have gone from groups of 8 to 8 billion because of one thing, and that's our ability to communicate. So what we're talking about is not kumbaya work that is sitting back and letting things happen, but is in fact trying to solve the problem of polarization that guarantees that nothing else gets solved. So I think we got to start making the offensive case. It's 2023. 2024 is coming up, and people are wondering, why does this matter? And we got to make that case. And that's what our young people are doing across campuses.
So inspiring. Thanks, buddy. The way we started this conversation is no accident. Many organizations, as Becca talked about, have their favorite conversation norms, agreements, tips, tools. One that's pretty pervasive is to start with your story, right? To start getting to know that individual. And so that's what we've done here in these few minutes. We've already heard Kami talk about some of his favorite tips around listening, and Becca articulated several from Bridge USA. It's been fun from my position to see all the many tips and tools that are out there, and they all offer so much. Just for the audience's benefit, I'll offer those that I've personally kind of run with as my favorite 3 tips and the associated tools. The 3 tips, which we've used in some of the national campaigns that we've co-created together, are listen with curiosity, speak from your own experience, what you just heard these leaders doing, and connect with respect. And then with credit to our friends at Resetting the Table, and later today you have a chance to screen the Purple documentary, which made me cry. It was over Christmas about 2 years ago when I finally listened to it and watched it. So stick around for that. But Resetting the Table has some tools that I like to attach to those tips. So when you think about listening with curiosity, as Kami talked about, think about the bullseye reflection. Resetting the Table describes this as reflecting back what I think I understood Becca to say, and doing so until not I'm convinced and sure I got it right, but Becca says, Pierce, you nailed it. That's what I meant. That's what I meant to convey. And when it comes to speaking from your own experience, Becca actually talked about this as well. I statements, not talking points, right? Use those I statements and talk about where you're coming from. And then finally, as we connect with respect, I love the concept of naming differences. I think this aligns well with what Manu was just talking about. Like, we're not just going to kind of subvert those parts of ourselves that might be a little edgier, might be passionate, might be filled with conviction. No, bring that, name that. I hear that the difference between us might be X, and then you're kind of back to the bullseye reflection, right? So I just wanted to put some of those best practices on the table. Y'all have already shared some, but do you have your own favorite tips, tools, norms that you love folks to leave with today?
I bet we all do, right?
Yeah.
Let me double down on listening and talk about why I think that's so an important one. When a person feels heard, the chemicals in their brain that are released are the same chemicals when you feel loved.
Mm.
That's powerful. When you feel loved and you feel heard, your defensiveness comes down. So if you're trying to convince me of your point of view, the best thing you can do as an advocate of your viewpoint is to listen to me, right? Because then my defense goes down and then my level of trust in you goes up. And then suddenly when you tell me what you think, I trust you a little bit more. My defense is going down. I'm receptive to it. You cannot get to that without listening. And too many people try it the other way. They're like, I'm going to just tell you what I think and I'm going to hammer my points home and I'm so eloquent and I've got all the facts. But if you're just speaking to a person whose defense is high and they're not listening, then it doesn't matter. You're never going to convince anybody. But I tell activists that all the time. Your best tool is not speaking. Your best tool is actually listening, developing trust, and then speaking.
Yes, understanding that even if it's just for our own self-interest, that's going to help us build broader coalitions and advocate for what we believe in. Becca, you named so many good ones, and there's the 6 agreements, which I'm sure you could recite. But for you personally, and for you, let's talk about, as it comes closer to home, as you talk about your home and your community, what one do you kind of lead with and see having the greatest impact to set the right tone of what this is and what this isn't when you're trying to have a productive conversation?
And I think one of the setbacks or challenges to this kind of work is it feels like it has to happen in a container with all the right conditions.
Right.
Even our model is a 90-minute structured dialogue format. Like not everyone has time for that. So we spent some time kind of thinking about what is it really at the core of these conversations that make them successful. And I think that, and this is just my take on it, but I think it's setting aside the time and intention to engage. That this doesn't happen on the fly or as reactions. We're not maybe our best selves, but to say something like, mental health has been top of mind for me, and I would love to just get together and have a conversation about mental health. Whether you do a 90-minute structured dialogue or not, it gets everybody prepared and thinking about it. Because one of the key pieces, I think, to this work, to having a good bridging conversation or dialogue, is that you're being authentic and you're welcoming that from others, right? So it kind of gets you in that space. So I think it's time and intention. I think it's being aware of these things, like I'm going to listen, I'm going to be curious, I'm going to set aside judgment. I even kind of approach it like an experiment where it's like, okay, if I feel judgment coming up, like I'm going to write it down and I'm going to sit with myself later and be like, why did I have that reaction? or what are these assumptions that I'm just automatically making, so that you're kind of learning from it. And then it's asking questions. And that follow up and that checking back in, I think, is part of that. But I think that the time and intention is something that we can bring to our personal lives, because it's not going to happen. There are huge issues that we need to set aside the time and intention to talk about. And I even use, again, social media as a launching point. Like I've seen you've been posting a lot about this issue. I would love to get together and talk to you about it. Or even, with my own family, take it on the road. Like I don't see eye to eye. Or my mother-in-law was getting really frustrated with a couple of things that were happening in politics. And so I was like, you know what, can we just go on a walk? And I'd love to just understand. And in that hour walk, we talked about religion, we talked about race, we talked about the LGBTQ community and politics. And it was lovely. Like there was no tension, but it was because we'd set aside the time, we were asking those questions and we were listening to each other and trying to understand where we were coming from. So even outside of these structured things that all of these organizations offer, that's kind of, I think, what's really at the core.
Time and intention.
And I want to emphasize this point because, Kami said that listening is necessary because it helps you be a better advocate for your beliefs. You're talking about the fact that you can actually just do this in your daily life, that you don't have to be part of an organization or something. And we're talking about dialogue, we're talking about curiosity, we're talking about empathy. If you took away the fact that this has nothing to do with politics for a second, it sounds like a family therapy session.
Totally.
To me, this stuff sounds simple, right? And that's exactly it. We forget, and I think we extricate the human agency, the fact that we've contributed to the problem so much. I think I've told you this, Pierce. I'm not sure if I've shared this story with you, Becca or Kami. But sometimes, like, what I'll do is I'll just get on road trips, right? And just sort of drive to different states and stay at different bed and breakfasts and just talk to people. I know it sounds crazy. And again, this is why this stuff is not that complicated, right? You know, and so I remember my last road trip was from Austin to Boston, and it did Austin, Texas, then did Lake Charles, Louisiana, New Orleans, then we did Meridian, Mississippi, Selma, Alabama, then we went up through Georgia, then to North Carolina, and then ended in Boston. And you know, conservative pastors in Georgia, Black activists in Selma, students in Austin, everybody, you know, said something that fits within three things. You know, they all said that we want a family that is safe and secure. We want to live in a world in which our kids do better than ourselves. And we want to live in a country that cares about us. That's it. And the fact that we've gotten to a moment where we've, again, extricated the simplicity of human emotion out of the complexity of the problem that is polarization is just not only tragic, but I think it gives me hope, because it demonstrates that all it takes is you get out of your house, you write down on a note card 3 people that you have never spoken to that live in your area, and then you just break that 4th wall. That's it. And you do that at scale. What it does is, I think it doesn't necessarily create compromises, right? None of us have said the word compromise. None of us have said subsisting our values.
That's right.
But what it does is it creates the promise, and it helps us overestimate the power of that conversation. So I think what you guys are saying is right on. And importantly, I think those in the audience can relate to the fact that sometimes this feels like we're just preaching complex stuff, but really it just comes down to people.
Amen. That is so deeply empowering, I know, for all of us here. Jump around, whoever's inspired to answer. Talk about some of the wins that have kept you inspired and hopeful in this work.
I would just say, you know, one on a personal note and one more on a professional note. On a personal note, what brings me the hope is actually getting to meet folks like yourselves, and actually meeting people that are not only better than you at a lot of the different things that you're doing, but they have articulated complicated, fascinating theories. The relationships that I've built. The reason why that personal has nothing to do with the actual problem of political polarization, dialogue, collapse of faith in institutions, is because all of those things have people at the core of it. And so meeting people is incredibly inspiring. But the other thing, though, is professionally, the amount of students, and I'm sure, Kami, you've seen this at USC through the center, but the amount of students that come to our chapters and conversations, and they show up and they're like, this is just hokey pokey stuff, Manu. What are you doing? Right? Or what are we doing out here? Right? And they show up with their guard up, or they're the activists and they're ready. We did this discussion on homelessness at UC Berkeley. First people that showed up were the homeless folks that were in question. They were ready to protest. We said, hey, you can do whatever you'd like. We just like to have the conversation. You know who was the person talking most at the end? The homeless folks. And it was because I think people underestimate the power of human relationship, and I think they overestimate the power of things that aren't real, like Twitter. Right. So that's what keeps me going. Yeah.
I think the nice thing about this work, like, we know the tools work, right? It's not that what we're doing doesn't have impact and doesn't work. We have things like the Strengthening Democracy Challenge through Stanford, where there's these proven tools that work, or the Social Cohesion Impact Measure that Bridge USA used, or we had an 18-month study done with Fetzer Institute that proved that our tools work. So it's getting people to engage and realize that it's relevant for them. And so for me, something that continues to drive me are the stories. So, you know, something that I'll often say is, what's the conversation you wish you were having right now? What are the conversations you need to be having in your community, and what's getting in your way? Because we have all of these tools and all of these interventions that you can take and run with, but until it seems relevant to the individual, like that's where the magic happens, right? And I use the example of dialogue around guns a lot, because for me, you know, I did not grow up, I've never touched an actual gun. My family did not hunt. Like I have no relationship with guns at all. And so it's something that I've tried to be more intentional about understanding. And I've been in conversations where someone said, you know what? I grew up in an abusive household. My dad used guns to threaten my family. I will never have guns. No one should have guns. And then someone else says, I'm a mental health professional. I had a client who was unstable who threatened me and my family. I've never had a gun before, but now I feel like I need a gun. And then someone else who said, guns are part of my family culture. Like, this is what I did to bond like with my family, and I'll always have a gun because it's this very fond memory. And you can look at all three of those and be like, okay. Like, I can understand where you're coming from, because if that was my experience, I would probably feel the same way. And so for me, it's like, it's that magic of seeing that unfold. And I think that one of my, something that I would recommend is, even if you're involved in the field and you're offering the service to others, to make sure you're practicing, that you're part of those conversations and participating, because it's connecting with your why. And my why are these stories, like seeing people kind of expand their understanding and being able to offer my own experience into that and be an active participant in it, I think is what really keeps me going. So whether you're doing it with your own team, like, whoever you're working with and your colleagues, you're having those conversations, or any way you can make it happen. I think that's the strength of what we do.
Tell me, what win have you experienced that's kept you inspired and hopeful?
Well, this is the way I think about the wins. Is we are talking about wins against what? Wins on what front? Wins on interpersonal communication, wins on de-escalating the level of toxic polarization. When I think about it as polarization, not the I'm right, you're wrong polarization. That's fine. I'll take that all day long. That's the magic that makes democracy move forward. It's the I'm right, you're evil. That's the problem. So wins against that problem. What do I see as highlights there? I see the fact that STEM education had been receiving the lion's share of funding for decades in this country. And things like critical thinking, civics education, social studies education, they were getting fun. It is starting to go the other way, right? That's very empowering. 20 years ago, when I was in this field, I felt like I knew everybody, all the practitioners. Now there's hundreds of organizations, like the cavalry is coming over the hill, right? I think about things like critical thinking in schools. Now it is a core of not just Common Core. The National Math and Science Initiative has it. The National Council of Teachers of English have it as a pillar. The National Council for Social Studies, they're emphasizing that we need to get back to those question authority, look at both sides, ask questions. These are things that are happening. And then the last thing, Pierce, is the exhausted majority give me hope, right?
Yes.
None of us want this condition of feeling like we're the evil one in the conversation. We're like, I'm just living my life and trying to do my best, and I don't need your hatred directed at me, right? Most of us feel that way. And knowing that, we tend to focus on the most partisan people as the problems. But let's think about all the other people who are willing to join us and say, we might not be 100% aligned, but I'm tired of this too. So let's do something about it. And that really gives me hope.
Indeed. Our friends at Starts With Us recently commissioned a poll with YouGov that found 87% of Americans are tired of it, right? They want that way out. And that 87% being empowered, as Becca described, to take those steps, doing the work that so many of those joining us are doing as practitioners and as leaders yourselves, is that way out. We'll talk in a moment about some of the collective strategy and the ways we and the leaders joining us on the session here today think. But for me, a recent win that I keep going back to is at just the most personal level. I found myself at a retreat and meeting someone who does music out here in California, a guy named Josh. And, after learning the kind of work that I'm involved in, Josh came up and said, "Oh yeah, you went to Duke? That's cool. I went to Duke too. There's this guy that I graduated from Duke with. He was my closest friend when I was there. And then he went and got involved in politics, and he was in the Trump White House, and he was with Ted Cruz, and so on and so forth. And I just couldn't speak with him anymore. But it sucks, right? Like, this was my closest friend in college, and in this environment, I'm scared. I'm scared to talk to him. I don't know if he'd be willing to talk to me. I don't agree with some of his decisions. And I think what Josh was speaking to is that fear that we all have of crossing those chasms that seem deeper and deeper. As Josh kept talking, I was thinking, no way. There's no way. I only know one person who graduated from Duke in 1992, my friend Paul. And could he be talking about Paul? Is there any way? And fast forward, I'm sending a text to my friend Paul with Josh and I, and they've been able to have some Zoom calls and reconnect after decades of feeling totally ostracized from one another, judgmental of one another, toxically polarized on opposite sides of the political spectrum, but still having that nagging sense that they lost a relationship. They lost a relationship with someone that mattered. And as we try to do big things, and that's why we're here, that's why there's a National Day of Dialogue, we want to impact many people, many Americans of all backgrounds and beliefs. Paul and Josh reconnecting and rediscovering the humanity in themselves from their college friendship gives me a tremendous amount of hope. On that uplifting note, let's talk about the setbacks, right? What are some of the challenges that you all have faced that might be common across the field, across leaders and practitioners who are joining us? And how are you addressing them?
I think, this toxic polarization that we've kind of all brought up really is kind of the impetus of a lot of these setbacks, right? Like, it can feel really good to have this righteous anger, like to be like, I'm so frustrated about this thing, or like, I'm just talking to people who feel the same way as I am. And it, like you were saying, when you feel seen and heard, you get that sort of chemical release in your brain and you get this sort of high, and that can happen in an echo chamber, right? Like, and then everyone is just like ping, 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 ping. Yes, we're all on the same page. I feel seen and heard. We're so right. And I think that we have this sort of it's like a chronic misunderstanding, like, of other people. And I think that it's hard to, if you haven't done it before, develop this open mindset. And I think that where I see it happening most often is, or the antidote to that is in communities where you can, I can disagree with you and maybe vehemently disagree with you. Or during a political campaign season, you see the political signs out and you automatically start making assumptions about even the size of the sign, right? Is the bigger the sign mean like the more all in you're in and the less I'm going to be able to talk to you about it. But then at the same time, you're still like, your kids are playing on the same soccer team. Like, you're part of this community and you can't escape each other. And so I think that those assumptions unchecked is one of the hugest roadblocks to the work that we're doing. And if you're only talking to people who believe the same way that you do, then there's no one to check the assumptions for you. And I was recently reading a book, and then I'll wrap up because I tend to go on. I was recently reading a book called On Dialogue, and they talked about being curious about the genealogy of your assumptions. Like, where does this come from? Like, what have I inherited it from? And so I think there's some work that we can do as individuals and being self-reflective of like, where is this all coming from? And then trying to do more to share stories like your story with Josh of, oh yeah, we were in this, like, could not be in relationship with each other. And I think that we found, statistics show that a lot of people broke relationships with family members after the 2016 elections, or that large percentages of Republicans and Democrats both say we'd be better off if large chunks of the opposite party just died.
Yep.
That we're at this point that, we just need to be able to check our assumptions, and that should be kind of a regular process.
I'm going to do that annoying thing that I used to do in class, which is kind of shift your question a little bit and pretend not to answer it. So instead of setbacks, I'm going to treat the question a little bit more as, what are the challenges that prevent this work? And by this work, I mean bridge building dialogue from being the most dominant, I think, mindset in our politics and society and our communities. So Bridge USA's journey was, after 2017, we had about 3 chapters, and then we had about 10. Then by 2020, we had about 20. And then suddenly something interesting started happening where we got to about 50. And now the goal is to get to 250 in colleges and high schools by 24. And as we saw that growth, and as we saw the sort of the different inclinations of students, and as we looked at the undulations of how people are approaching this work, I think our work faces 3 sets of challenges. I think the first is a language challenge. I think it's something that I was talking about earlier. We've touched on this briefly. The language challenge that we face is people think that we are in our own bubble of optimism and utopia and are detached from the realities of struggle in their life. They think that we don't understand that there are real problems that require tangible solutions. That again, it's that squirt gun meeting the fire. How does this, the first question we oftentimes get asked when we do a discussion, let's say on police brutality is, well, how does this prevent a police officer from shooting the black person? Or how does this prevent my community from having more faith or having more faith?
Mm-hmm.
People don't see the connection between our work and tangible change, and we have to articulate that. I think the second set of challenges that we face is a scale challenge, which is that we don't, I think, yet understand as a field and as people doing this work that we have to speak and meet people where they are, right? It's great that I've got a bunch of personal stories, but if the person that's listening to this thinks it's hokey pokey, it doesn't matter. And I think the third thing is we have to articulate the moment that the country is in with the importance of this work. Why should this be the most important thing that someone listening right now should pick up and do, as opposed to going and joining campaign, right? Why is it that in January of 2023, as the US is about to enter another very divisive political cycle, why is dialogue and bridge building necessary? So those are, I think, the three sets of challenges we have to address.
Beautiful. I'm so excited to turn to the questions that you all have been asking. Please continue to submit those questions, and we'll use our last 15 minutes or so to address them. I'm going to go with this one, piggybacking on what Manu just shared. What have been the most significant losses experienced during this age of polarization? And how can we benchmark off of what works to bring about advancement in these same areas? I think that's the third point Manu was just making, is what's the pain we're seeing? What are we losing? Why should this be a priority? And how do we directly address some of those pain points and losses that Americans of all backgrounds and beliefs are seeing all around them?
I'll answer that one. I think it's a great question because it speaks to the challenges, right? And it speaks to the setbacks. I got to think about it in terms of what is driving toxic polarization, period. What is causing this to happen? And when I think about that, I think about unifiers shrinking, right? So these are the centripetal force, things that bring us together. Those are declining. The public square is shrinking. You can sit on your couch. You don't have to go to the movie theater to watch a show. You don't have to leave your couch to order groceries. The participation in unions is at an all-time low. Attendance of churches, mosques, temples, all-time lows. The retails, malls are declining, right? The public square is shrinking. So the unifiers are shrinking. So can we be unifiers in whatever way we can, build community in whatever way you can? Then I think about the other driver of polarizations, which are the dividers. And the dividers are escalating like crazy. And we talk about, right, we all know the conflict entrepreneurs term from Amanda Ripley, right? And so we're looking at news organizations and news outlets and how partisan messaging is really resonating and is really profitable, right? And we look at that and it's not getting less, it's getting more, right? And when we look at other drivers of polarization, the lack of funding in civics education, it's still 5 cents to the dollar in education, right? It's a big old nothing. So we got to do better on that front. Then we look at the increasing partisanship in our political institutions, right? And the high stakes games in these small number of elections that are really determining the outcome of who controls Congress. The magic of democracy, where you don't know if it's the D or the R who's going to win, it's happening in somewhere around 5, 7, 8% of our electoral districts. That's it. The rest of them are so predictable because of how gerrymandered it is. Look at Supreme Court decisions that are 5-4 and clearly political in some cases. All right, so we look at that and think, gosh, it can't be like this. These dividers will they tear our democracy apart? And a lot of us are frankly concerned about that. Like for immigrant families who believed in the promise of America, they came here thinking this was the land of opportunity, and they get here and see this isn't real democracy. The system is rigged. The moneyed interests are taking over. We see racial injustice everywhere, and this is very disheartening, right? But we're still the land of opportunity, and there's still the fact that we're even having this conversation and that IDEOS is hosting a National Day of Dialogue means that Americans are very bootstrap oriented. We are problem solvers. We are good decision makers, and we want to get past these problems. So the long answer to your short question about setbacks, yeah, they're everywhere. They're everywhere. And so is the motivation to overcome them.
And I'll just piggyback on that a little bit, because I think what you're talking is at scale. And I think another serious loss that we've had is in those interpersonal relationships, that this muscle to be able to be in tension, to disagree and still respect each other is kind of atrophied. And so there are a lot of people, we talk about being able to be in dialogue is being able to be authentic in conversation with other people. And when you identify so personally with some of these issues, right? Like if you're a survivor of domestic violence, if you come from a family that's immigrated into the United States, like they're highly personal. And so if I can't talk about that with people because I feel like I'm going to be canceled or I'm going to be shut down, then I'm not bringing my whole self to that relationship. And you were talking about the public square, and especially the in-person public square shrinking, that you can find online communities that feel very niche, like this is my identity is wrapped up in this thing. And so all of my personal relationships now, they're less proximate in person, and now they're online or they're somewhere else. And that's kind of how we can get into like this really, radicalization and stuff where you can't find it, or you don't feel comfortable investing in the personal relationships, people around you, because you can't bring up these things that are so critical, that you start going other places, which then just kind of reinforces the polarization that we see.
Becca, that's a great segue to another question that you all have asked. It feels like social media plays a huge role in our perception of polarization. Social media also creates echo chambers that dilute our ability to converse with those who might have different opinions than our own. How can social media be used effectively to reduce perceptions of polarization? Any strategies for addressing polarization in the digital space?
I'll be super brief because I know we want to get through as many questions as possible. As the resident young person that apparently loves social media, I don't. This is a really important question because it actually, there's a theme here that Kami raised and that you raised, Becca, about the shrinking of the public square and the fact that there's the extreme elements that are dominating, that conflict entrepreneurs are growing. I want to throw out 3 statistics, 1 with respect to social media and 2 with respect to our politics. Social media, 20% out of all of the user-generated content on social media, do we know how much of that is actually produced by users? 20%, meaning 20% of users generate 90% of the content on social media. So if there are 10 people on Twitter, 2 of them are producing 90% of the content. In our primaries, 10% of Americans vote in primaries. And in our Supreme Court cases, you have 100 people picking 9 people to decide massive cases. I don't think this is a problem of the masses polarizing. I think it's a problem of the extremes dominating. And then what happens is the rest of us that are not wired for conflict, that don't get a dopamine rush of putting someone down, are like, screw this. And so then slowly, those 10 people on Twitter, 5 of them will leave. 6 of them will leave. And now suddenly 66% of the content on Twitter is generated by those conflict entrepreneurs. So all we got to do is hang in there. The last thing on social media is when it comes to respect with our algorithms and the way that these companies are driving division. The only quick thing I'll just say on this is when we think about social media problems, yes, there are companies that need to be held responsible. And yes, there needs to be oversight. But ultimately, Mark Zuckerberg is not clicking the like button. You are. We got to have some agency.
Yeah. How about this gnarly space? Where's the opportunity for redemption and pro-social behavior?
I'll just mention 2 things. One, I want to plug the Flip Side, which is a organization that is looking at this critically and reevaluate, like prioritizing a different kind of algorithm where people who disagree like each other think that will rise to the top. So kind of combating echo chambers. And secondly, I think, again, I keep going back to questions. I have a friend on social media that whenever something's coming up in the news, she'll just say, tell me, I'm really curious to see where you all are landing. Like, how is this impacting you? And just offering more questions instead of opinions and facts, because what I see happen on social media is you read something or a tweet or even the heading of an article, you have some sort of internal reaction, and there's no time to sit and think about, why do I care about this? You've already shared it. Like, it's already gone and out there. And so we're not sitting with things. And I think questions inherently make you pause for a second and think about whatever the content is, and then respond to it.
That's good.
The social media question is so big. It is one of the primary drivers of social division in this country. And if we had a magic button to make it go away, I bet a lot of us would just press that button, right? And so the antidotes to it, if the social media company is using algorithm to profit on division, shame on them, right? Shame on them. There's government regulations and looking at Section 529 and other things we can do to sort of regulate the companies into better behavior. However, you're right. Who's clicking the like button? We are, right? So shame on me. Shame on me for only liking the stuff that's in my political lane, right? I need to go out of my box, and I advise everyone to do this. Trick the algorithms. Like stuff that you wouldn't normally like, just to be exposed to it, just for that reason. And last point on social media is take a break from it. It can be toxic. You miss the context. It's not the same as a 1 hour walk to have a 1 hour 90 character exchange or 140 character exchange with somebody. Just turn it off and go call that person or go visit that person, and don't do it on social media, because it's not the platform for civil discourse.
As context for our last audience submitted question, you've each played a leading role in driving collective impact in our mission as part of the Bridging Movement Alignment Council, BMAC. Indeed, you're all on the steering committee, and so appreciate your service to the movement in that. The engines of our collective impact within this BMAC structure are the working groups. And one of these working groups, which each one of you fed into goals and measures, came up with a 3-layer framework that now serves as our strategic roadmap for the bridging movement. It's that by building the capacity of the bridge building field and then mobilizing bridge building will and skill beyond our field into other sectors, communities, and individuals, that we will shift social norms from that division, distrust, contempt, into connection and understanding and belonging. With that in mind, someone asked, how can we make bridging work seem like a fun thing to do on a Friday night? Or calling it another name and kind of tricking, for lack of a better word, people into bridging under the guise of another activity. This is the mobilization, right? This is mobilizing beyond us weirdos who want to dedicate our lives to this mission, beyond the early adopters, beyond everyone joining us here. How do we make it fun on a Friday night? How do we embed it in everyday lives so that it becomes that norm?
Everybody just looked at me apparently because
I was looking to see if someone else.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you talked about fun. I want to hear.
First of all, I'll say that Liz Joyner at Village Square excels at this.
Yeah.
So the way that she frames her events are as social events, and this is fun, and using humor, I think, can be great. I think that, something that you kind of talked about, instead of this being pie in the sky, it's got to be something that makes sense to individuals. And so I think kind of striking on that, what's something that you really want to talk about, or just challenging yourself. And then I think you can make it social. I think you can have a dinner and say, we created these conversation buffets. So let's talk about race or current events, or let's talk about women. And then we've grabbed questions from our guides. And so you could just have a dinner and say, everyone pick a question that you want to answer here. And we're just going to get curious about what we all think.
And there's something even deeper here, Becca, which is that when we started Bridge Berkeley, the number one way that we attracted people was beer and pizza.
Yeah, food.
The amount of times we've told funders that actually, yes, what needs to honestly be a part of the investment is you got to build shared identity with people. Like the reason why all of us stick with this work, yes, we're passionate. Yes, there's purpose, but we would also be lying a little bit if we said that it was only that. It's also because I have some of my best friends doing this work. I live still with Ross, who's my co-founder, right? This is our group. Our job is to make this group as large as possible so that if you're not in the group, it's not because of us, but it's because of your choice. This is the open access group, right? So like Liz's events, Kami, what we've done at USC, socials, 100%. Every successful social movement requires shared identity, because at the end of the day, we as people just want to be part of something bigger than ourselves and have fun doing it.
Amen.
That's
Yeah,
it.
and I think the fun looks very different. So if you're a religious organization, your fun might be, let's have a dialogue about something in your community or student organization. What's a better show? Is it The Bachelor or is it Survivor? Or it might be, you want to build the muscle that has atrophied. And you can do that by looking at both sides of any issue, right? So the idea is develop the muscle, and that can be fun just to have these kinds of exchanges with your friends.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being part of the National Day of Dialogue. You give me hope. You give us hope. And please be empowered by these leaders and by many others, by the other sessions today, to help your community, your household, turn down the heat and find a way forward together. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.